Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor, moderated by Professor Mike Kaler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by Kroll. Kroll is trusted by companies and compliance officers worldwide to help prevent, detect, and remediate FCPA challenges with scalable end-to-end compliance solutions. From high-volume third-party screening and automated monitoring, to risk-based due diligence, to complex investigations and monitorships. With leading experts, global resources, and advanced technology, Kroll is uniquely positioned to meet all your FCPA needs.
Thank you for listening to the FCPA Flash podcast. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and I invite you to my next FCPA Institute in Phoenix, Arizona on January 11th through the 12th. To learn more about the two-day FCPA Institute and how it has elevated the FCPA knowledge and practical skills of a diverse group of professionals, please visit fcpaprofessor.com and click on the FCPA Institute page. Welcome to FCPA Flash. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and in this episode I am pleased to be joined by Jonathan Drimmer. Jonathan is a Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Barrick Gold Corporation. Before this, he was a partner at Steptoe & Johnson in Washington, D.C., and a Deputy Director in the DOJ's Office of Special Investigations. Among other activities, Jonathan is on the Board of Directors at Trace International, on the Board of Directors of the UN Global Compact's Canada Network, and is a subject matter expert at Canada's Centre for Excellence on Anti-Corruption. Thanks for joining me today, Jonathan.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. Really appreciate you having me on.
So you're a U.S. lawyer serving in-house at a Canadian company. The Canadian company Barrick Gold has shares traded on a U.S. exchange. And because of this, your company is subject to both Canada's FCPA-like law, the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, as well as the FCPA. Which law and its enforcement keeps you up more at night, and why?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, let me start by providing a bit of perspective, and it's one of the great contributions that you make to this field is to help deliver perspective. And for me, and for most people who do compliance work in-house, it's fair to say that there are a lot of things that keep me up at night. I'm up at night a lot for a lot of reasons, and anti-corruption is only one of those areas. It's an important area, but it's only one area. And within the anti-corruption space, there's no question that the FCPA and the CFPOA are among those anti-corruption laws that are most frequently enforced around the world. But we also have anti-corruption laws in all of the countries where we have operations. Barrick is a senior mining company. We have operations and exploration activities around the world. It's important to be mindful of those laws as well. And so the FCPA and CFPOA are two important laws, but they are just two of the laws that we are subject to in the anti-corruption space globally. But to answer your question directly between the CFPOA and FCPA, there's no question that for me, it's the FCPA. And I say that I think the RCMP does a great job of enforcing the CFPOA, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I've been an open supporter of what they've done for years and keep the playing field level for honest companies and prevent cycles of poverty and violence within the developing regions that you see with corruption, and this is really important stuff. But truthfully, there's a lot more in terms of investigatory and prosecution work under the FCPA, and their numbers are just a lot higher. It's been much more active in terms of FCPA enforcement, and so that's the reason that, to me, it does keep me up at night. And you have to remember, in Canada, there's only criminal jurisdiction with criminal laws and a criminal burden of proof, and you don't have something that's really equivalent to the FCC and its civil enforcement mechanism, and you don't have DPAs in Canada, so you've got fewer investigations. The scope is narrower, and that's part of the reason you see this disparity in enforcement. And I know if you step back, it sounds a little odd for me to say that the FCPA keeps me up more, since I work for a company that's domiciled in Canada, a jurisdiction that has a foreign corruption law that really is investigated by highly skilled law enforcement and it really is prosecuted. But nonetheless, that is the case.
Yeah, in your answer, you raise a good point. It's very popular, it seems, to compare U.S. enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to other nations' enforcement of their FCPA-like laws. But as you note, these laws are not necessarily carbon copies of each other and how they're enforced. You note that in the United States, there's obviously dual jurisdiction as to publicly traded companies. That yields more enforcement than other nations like Canada that does not have this dual jurisdiction. And then the United States obviously has a plethora of resolution vehicles that are used, as well as different legal standards than some of the other OECD member countries. So all very important points for listeners to keep in mind if you're interested in tracking apples to oranges enforcement, which is kind of what happens in this space.
Yep, it's true.
So there are some people, and I'm literally not making this up because this has been an exact quote used in some writing, there are some people that believe that compliance with anti-bribery and corruption laws is easy. You just don't bribe. What would you say to such a person who would be making such an absolutist statement like that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish it were that easy. Of course, if it were that easy, that none of us would have jobs on the compliance side in house. I mean, look, you have there are several reasons why that statement really just doesn't work from a practical sense. As it's applied to the enforcement mechanisms in the compliance world that we exist in. I mean, first and foremost, you've got these very broad interpretations of what things of value are when we think of bribery. In essence, the way that it's been interpreted and enforced, every interaction with a government official who has some level of discretionary authority has the potential for a corruption problem, and that's something that certainly we directly train on. But when you extend things of value outside of things with monetary value, and it goes to favors, and I'm thinking of the New Skin resolution from earlier this year where they called out a letter of recommendation for an official's child to a U.S. college as a thing of value, you really do get into a sphere where quid pro quo takes on a much broader scope, a much broader meaning than traditional cash in a paper bag. So the interpretation of things of value really is part of why that statement is awfully simplistic. But also, and I think this goes more direct to some of the compliance challenges that all companies that try to comply with the FCPA have, and that is third parties, and where due diligence can be different for a whole host of reasons. If you look within compliance programs, a lot of companies spend a disproportionate amount of time in their general onboarding approach. A lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources is devoted to their general onboarding of third parties, not necessarily in-depth due diligence into agents and government-affiliated vendors where you already know there's some level of risk. But in their general vendor pool, where every single vendor, wherever they operate, whatever they do, has to have a basic level of due diligence performed in relation to anti-corruption. I mean, we do it, a lot of companies do it, but I'll tell you, it takes up a lot of oxygen for an anti-corruption program, and you have to wonder, whether that aspect of a program is really where the focus and emphasis should be.
With that onboarding process, the FCPA, of course, does not specifically set forth what a company needs to do, I agree that that seems to be the de facto requirement, but that begs a related question of where do you think this de facto requirement is coming from? Do you think it comes from the enforcement agencies? Do you think it comes from, what I've called before FCPA Inc., the very vibrant multi-billion-dollar industry that's active in this space? Where do you think this quote-unquote requirement comes from?
Yeah, look, I think we all play a part in this requirement or expectation or standard or whatever the right term is. I don't know that it's a requirement as much as we all, from an in-house standpoint, we look around and we're risk-averse and we see what other people are doing, and we don't want to be the one to design a program that has the kind of gaps that other companies, our peer companies, don't have. And we certainly don't want to design a program that has a gap that can let in a wolf in sheep's clothing, where you don't have due diligence done and you get a third party who comes in and you've got problems. No question as well, I think that the FCPA bar doesn't want to provide advice to companies that they should scale back their third party onboarding efforts. And if they provide advice that allows the bad third party to slip in, they're in trouble, and I don't think it's in really their interests. So ought to talk about more streamlined companies. For due diligence firms, it's a very competitive market. They obviously want more instead of less third-party onboarding for their own commercial reasons. And no question, the enforcement authorities, which do a very good job and are clearly looking to enforce the laws within their mandate in a way that they think is just and right. Some of those enforcement decisions do have fairly broad interpretations, and so the impression that's left for folks in supply chain and procurement is that if you miss a vendor in onboarding, you're going to cost the company millions of dollars. You're going to get fired or go to jail if they have some kind of government affiliation. So I think we all play a role in it, but it is driven by this risk aversion in-house.
Now, when you read a typical FCPA enforcement action, from a garden variety type enforcement action to even a fairly egregious type enforcement action, the conduct is, all things considered, generally rather isolated and sometimes may focus literally on just one third party or a very small group of actors, when the reality is that particular company may have thousands, if not tens of thousands of third-party agents. Do you think from the enforcement standpoint there is a bit of hindsight is 20/20 when you know the end of the story, when you know the problematic third party, you can always go back and say woulda, coulda, shoulda? How do you read some of the recent enforcement actions in this space, and whether the expectations are actually even consistent with the statutory standards, which of course are having internal controls that provide reasonable assurances?
Yeah, I think it is part of the problem in terms of how the compliance approach is developed, and to be specific, when I mean it's part of the problem, hindsight is 20/20, and so you are reading enforcement decisions where things have gone wrong, and you can trace all the way back where the first misstep occurred, and you want to avoid those missteps at the very outset. But you're right, a lot of the decisions do focus on a single vendor, and we've had a number of decisions over the last few years that really do focus on a single vendor and whether they have a friendship or a relationship with a government official, or whether it's a related party to the company. I'm thinking of Hyperdynamics last year, and we had Halliburton just a month or so ago, and it really creates a very difficult standard for companies other than to onboard every vendor and to apply a very broad level of due diligence across your spectrum, knowing that, again, if you miss any one of these, you really don't know what the ultimate steps are going to be that could lead to a problem.
And I often describe this dynamic through a sports analogy. You can look at Well, we're nearing the baseball playoff season here, and sure, the Houston Astros and the Los Angeles Dodgers are having great years, but let's face it, they've lost many, many games. They've committed several errors throughout the year. But the good thing in sports is we look at things a bit more holistically in a team's entire body of work, and not through the prism of just one at-bat where someone strikes out, or not through the prism of just one road series where they may have been swept. And, I think the same should be true in the FCPA context, particularly because the statutory standard is actual reasonable assurances, not absolute assurances.
Yeah, you play 600 baseball, and you're a great team. There's no question. Look, I think for a lot of us, we put into programs that we do try to create reasonable assurance, and then the question really is, what is reasonable within that context? And again, the fairly standard expectation is you're going to do some level of due diligence, for all of your third parties, 100% of your third parties, or the overwhelming majority of your third parties. And, hard to really know if that's the right line or if there's a different line when you do have the possibility that, something goes wrong, you let the wrong guy in. And again, prosecution decisions are ultimately made in 20/20 hindsight.
Well, regardless of whether these enforcement theories are viable given the terms of the statute, and regardless of who is maybe at fault for creating these unrealistic expectations, they are what they are when it comes to foreign third parties. But let's face it, companies have domestic third parties as well that can also expose the company to a wide variety of legal liability. Now, with your company and others that are similarly situated, is there as much emphasis on domestic third parties compared to foreign third parties? And I'm guessing you're going to say no, but that begs the question of, well, why not?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And for us, it's a little bit different, being domiciled in Canada and having the CFPOA. U.S. vendors, are domestic for our U.S. operations, of course, but they're foreign under the CFPOA, and it's the same thing in Canada. So we really don't draw much distinction between U.S. domestic vendors, since we treat them as foreign under the CFPOA. But as a general proposition, there really isn't any question that U.S. domestic vendors can get you into a whole heap of trouble, and that isn't just under the FCPA. If they are working abroad, or for us the CFPOA, if it's being enforced. I mean, these are important laws: anti-corruption laws, overseas anti-corruption laws, foreign corruption laws. These are really important laws, but they're just one body of laws. And a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about foreign third parties, relying on the fact that the U.S. is heavily regulated with active licensing programs that generally considered to be fairly low risk. So they think there's no real worry, but it's really a false sense of comfort. I mean, there's active law enforcement on state and federal levels that pushes in the other direction. You have a whole heavy body of different potential civil and criminal laws that third parties can get you into trouble with. And so, I do think it's a fair question, from an emphasis standpoint, whether companies do have the right balance in terms of attention on foreign versus domestic third parties, and really where that balance ought to be.
Because, it's an interesting dynamic, and part of my thought process on this is informed by being an expert in some arbitrations involving foreign third parties where FCPA issues are embedded in the case. And it just seems from my perspective that foreign third parties are presumed corrupt unless they can prove themselves ethical, whereas domestic third parties are presumed ethical unless they're proven corrupt. And it's just a strange dynamic when, as you rightly note, all third parties, regardless of where they're located, can expose a company to legal liability.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about risk tiering, that's really what we're talking about here, is risk tiering and what that really means. And the truth is, third parties can create a lot of legal risks for you under anti-corruption laws, under other laws as well. And where you do have programs that have such an emphasis on anti-corruption, you can almost forget the fact that you got a whole bunch of other laws that also are applicable to your operations, and that you should keep in mind as you're designing your compliance programs.
So one theme in your answers, including just now, and I think rightly so, is that the FCPA, the CFPOA, these are all important laws, but at the end of the day, a person in your position, these are just one of many laws that need to be on your radar screen, and I think that's very important to keep in mind, and that flows through perhaps also to another undeniable best practice in the anti-bribery and corruption space, and that's training. Training your employee base, training your third parties perhaps on your company's FCPA or related compliance program. What in your experience are some of the difficulties and challenges surrounding this?
Yeah, we do a lot of training, which is consistent with the fairly standard advice you hear from everyone. Live training based on, an individualized risk analysis, online training for others who might not be in that same risk level, training during onboarding, etc. And then you get frequent messages and reminders from company leaders. We talk about the program every month in a global leaders video conference, etc. It gets a lot of airtime. And there are two real challenges with that. From the consumer end anyway, the trainee anyway, and they present really two types of questions and complaints. And the first one, on the training side, people just get bored. They get bored with hearing about the same kinds of issues so often, and you have to come up with different ways to keep it interesting, or they tune it out, and ultimately it's a waste of their time. So this year we are, in our program, we're doing global training modeled on the Family Feud game show, and that seems to be going pretty well. People seem to be engaged with it, and it seems to be driving home our points. But it's tough to keep thinking of new methods of delivery each year, and I'll have to come up now with something, for next year. But the second, and this I think is the larger point, is you got to deal with training fatigue more generally, not just on hearing a lot about anti-corruption. I mean, there are a lot of things to train on that are also really important operational issues for us as an extractive company, health and safety, for instance. Workplace conduct like harassment, bullying, and anti-discrimination. We've got cybersecurity training, disclosure issues, human rights, documents and information management, values and leadership. There's just a ton of training and a lot of competition for attention. And people then ask, within this overall framework where there is all of this training, why is anti-corruption elevated to such a prime position of importance? I mean, they ask, there are other laws we have to abide by, some of which are also aggressively investigated and prosecuted and have civil and criminal penalties. So why does this set of laws have such a focus? And it is a lot. You struggle to keep it interesting, and then you have to explain why companies do emphasize it as much as they do. But certainly, some of the feedback is that it takes this position of prominence, and people do ask about the logic of that, which then makes it incumbent on us to talk about the expectations that are out there. But I would say fatigue and boredom are two of the issues that you really have to deal with when you are trying to train a global workforce.
Yeah, and I think those are great observations. I've always viewed all compliance, including training, as really serving two purposes. One is to, obviously, in good faith, mitigate your risk. And the second purpose is, should something bad happen 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the road, to tell the best story possible if under investigation. And part of telling that best story possible often is more, not less. But as you correctly note, I think, there is fatigue, there is boredom, there is cynicism when employees are constantly reminded about just one specific area of law, perhaps to the exclusion of other laws that can similarly expose a company to legal scrutiny. It's I can only imagine a tough dynamic that you and other in-house counsel deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the important things that we try to do is drive, in addition to the risk mitigation, is really connect it to values and core values, and how all of these types of trainings from the legal standpoint flow from the importance of acting ethically at all times. And that way, even if you're not training on a specific fact, they'll have this reservoir of understanding of appropriate behavior and company expectation that will hopefully help drive conduct. But look, it's challenging, and hearing even that over and over again is something that you can get some pushback on.
Today's guest has been Jonathan Drimmer. He's the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Barrick Gold Corporation, a Canadian company with shares traded on a U.S. exchange and thus subject to both the FCPA as well as Canada's FCPA-like law. Thanks for sharing your insight today with FCPA Flash podcast listeners.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.